What would be a more likely explanation, perhaps, is that this is a world that we interact with, perhaps in the womb. Um, that's a possibility. It's much closer. So that's much easier to imagine. Is that whilst we're in the womb, we are actually, because DMT levels we know in rats at least, it's never been shown in humans, but DMT levels are actually very high in the neonate rat, but then start to drop off a few days later. So maybe DMT levels are very high whilst we're in the womb. We're actually connected to, do we come from the DMT world in some way, and that we kind of we maintain that connection whilst we're in the womb. And this might lay down certain patterns. This might explain why the DMT world is so uncannily familiar. For example, we feel like we've been there before. It's like returning home, and you will often get a welcome, a grand celebratory uproar as you burst into that space, and the bells are ringing, the lights are flashing, and they're saying, welcome home. So maybe, there is something to that.
An
Pure speculation.
An equivalence perhaps with shamanic realms reported by shamans that they're in altered states. Bear in mind, listeners, they don't always use psychedelics. The shamans are often just using shakers to go into those altered states, and they report passing into alternate realms. I mean, is there an equivalence there that could be somewhere in our deep sort of ancient DNA there?
It's possible. I think there's so many possible explanations. I don't think we're probably, there's so many kind of different hypotheses. And
well, I share your skepticism regarding the
so
collective unconscious.
Yeah, which do you choose?
Regarding the collective unconscious, I really share your skepticism there. But I'm so interested in shamanic reports and these very, very interesting hybrid creatures and sort of human-animal crosses, but it doesn't explain the fact that there really isn't much of the human or even the natural world in those experiences. Okay, right, cut away to the history for a moment, because we've got to get a little bit of it because it's so fascinating. Psychedelic chemists like yourselves just have such a lot to thank a certain character here, Alexander Shulgin, also known as Sasha. From the late 1950s onwards, he synthesized more than 230 different psychedelic molecules, my God, inventing many of them, which we now see on the market, like MDMA, 2CB, including the tryptamines like 5meoDMT. And he long campaigned for the return of using these molecules for therapeutic purposes. Tell us a little bit about the important influence of this legend in the field and what his work kind of opened up conceptually for future chemists.
Yeah, I was actually at Shulgin's house this summer. It was his 100th birthday. He's posthumous, of course. I mean, he passed away a few years ago, and his wife as well now. But I think his daughter-in-law.
Well, it certainly goes to show maybe that there's new research now saying psilocybin actually lengthens your cell life. So, perhaps that's why he lived to such a ripe old age.
He certainly did. Well, as did Albert Hoffman. Albert Hoffman, I think, was 102, 103 when he died. Discoverer of LSD. Zara, I think, was 98. Stephen Zara, discoverer of DMT. So discover a psychedelic and you'll live a long...
Bit of a spanner in the works for longevity research, right?
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, Shulgin, he was peerless, really, because he was a chemist. He loved chemistry. He loved the idea that you could make a molecule that had never existed ever in the history of the universe. In his little backyard, he has this laboratory. It looks like a greenhouse, almost. This very a proper chemist, like an alchemist's lab, really. And from here, as you said, he started from a basic kind of the prototypic psychedelic, or one of them, of the phenethylamine class, mescaline. And then he simply asked the question, well, what if we change this molecule in a certain way? What if we remove this group or replace this group with something else, switch things around a bit? How will this still be a psychedelic? Will it have other effects? And so he kind of semi-systematically started making changes to the mescaline molecule, starting with that. And I think he made like 170 or something like that. They all appeared in his book, Phenethylamines I Have Known and Loved, PCAL. And he tried every single one on himself, first of all. He didn't give it to rats or rabbits or mice. He gave it to himself. He swallowed, self-tested. He had this idea that you build a relationship with a molecule. When the molecule is born, a molecule that, as I said, has never existed anywhere in the universe ever, and he's got it. He's got the first sample that's ever existed of this molecule, and he's the first person, certainly, to try it. And he would swallow a small amount, and he would kind of very sensitive to the kind of effects. The hairs rise up in the back of the neck, or a little flushing, or a little tingling, whatever. And then he would, if he didn't feel that there was any toxic effects, he would increase the dose, and gradually he would, the molecule would reveal itself to him. The molecule, not on its own, of course, but the molecule in relationship to his mind. He was interested in exploring consciousness and exploring the mind, and using molecules to reach states of consciousness. So in the same way that he's building molecules that have never existed before in the universe, he's also reaching states of consciousness using these molecules that have never been reached before. So when people think about a drug experience, what is that? It's a change in consciousness, and certain drugs change consciousness in certain ways. Sometimes it's very dramatic, like DMT or 5-meoDMT, and sometimes it's much more subtle. And so he was building a relationship with these molecules. That relationship between the molecule in his mind. And when he discovered something that he thought was interesting, he would then give it to his wife, Anne Shulgin, and she would give her feedback on the molecule. And then he had a research team, which is a group of friends who would come around to the house, and they had this beautiful room with cushions and mats where they would hang out during the day and take this new molecule, and they would all have their experience, and then they would report back. And many of these reports appear in the second half of PCAL after the synthesis, the chemical synthesis, the cookbook, how to make this molecule. You have the dosage and the experience reports of what this molecule is like. And so it's like it was an entirely novel way of exploring consciousness. I think when people think about exploring consciousness, I think the kind of traditional way would be through meditation or something like that, or other kind of meditative or breath work or this kind of thing. And he said, no, we can use molecule. This is much more efficient. We can simply put a molecule into the brain, and then the way it interacts with the brain causes a change of consciousness. And from his work, as you said, hundreds of new molecules, and many of them now are mainstays, and they're beloved molecules. MDMA, of course, yes, he wasn't the first person to synthesize it. That was Merck, I think, in the early 20th century, but he was the first person to actually discover its psychoactive effects. But 2CB, 2CI, and many more that one could name, all of them were created by Sasha Shulgin. So he has this completely peerless legacy. No one has created so many psychoactive molecules. And of course, after the phenethylamines, he then shifted his attention to the tryptamines and did a similar thing, starting with tryptamine. Of course, DMT, 5-meoDMT, these are all tryptamines, but he made, again, I think, a slightly smaller number, but still dozens and dozens of novel tryptamines, which he also tried on himself.
And what...